House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to raise the important issue of the conflict in Tigray. It's the first time the House has had an opportunity to debate the conflict, which has, since last November, devastated Tigray, the mountainous region in the north of Ethiopia. I have given the Minister's Office advance sight of the questions I will be asking him at the end of my speech. There are many in the UK and beyond who will be listening very carefully to what he has to say. The conflict started in retaliation to an attack on the Northern Command by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. The Ethiopian federal government cut off all links into the region, closed roads, shut down communications, and sent its troops to surround Mekelle. We know that in addition to Ethiopian armed forces, Eritrean forces and Amharan militias are now also present in Tigray. Since November, over 60,000 Tigrayan people have fled into refugee camps in Sudan. Some are reported to have had their exit routes blocked by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. About 1 million people, some sources put the figure higher, have been internally displaced. 4.5 million people have become food insecure. Crops have been destroyed, livestock killed, and agriculture disrupted. Tigray is an area of chronic food insecurity. It's the scene of the devastating 1984 to 1985 famine. So deliberately cutting it off from food supplies and markets, as the Ethiopian government is alleged to have done, means people will starve. Yet up to 80% of the region is still inaccessible. Some of Tigray's and the world's most precious cultural heritage sites have been destroyed and priceless treasures looted. 70% of health facilities are reported to have been looted or vandalised by Ethiopian and Eritrean government forces, including very recently the only specialist clinic providing care to rape victims in Mekelle. Schools have been taken out of commission, used for housing troops or displaced people. 2 refugee camps at Hitsats and Shimelba have been razed to the ground. The whereabouts of 20,000 of the refugees they sheltered is still unknown. An estimated 50,000 civilians have been killed, with evidence that children have been targeted. And 10,000 women have been raped. Let that sink in. 10,000 women have been raped. The most terrible update from the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported continuing human rights abuses, severe malnutrition among young children, and a food security situation described as catastrophic. In considering this catalogue of destruction, I want to focus on 3 points. One is the nature of the conflict, the second is the use of rape as a weapon of war, and the third is the lack of action by the international community. Firstly, the nature of the conflict. The Ethiopian government originally said that the attack on Tigray was a law and order operation to deal with a long-running dispute, but multiple subsequent reports indicate a sustained and brutal assault that has included aerial bombardment and ground shelling of settlements with the deliberate targeting of civilians. This is not a little local difficulty in Ethiopia's backyard. It risks a much wider destabilisation and escalation of conflict throughout the Horn of Africa. Early information trickling out through the refugee camps in Sudan told right from the start of massacres of civilians. At Mai Kadra, where responsibility is hotly contested, witnesses have spoken of both Ethiopian government and Tigrayan militia involvement. Most notably, last November, there was a brutal massacre at Axum, one of the holiest Christian sites in Ethiopia. A total of 750 people are thought to have been killed. The stories circulating last year on social media were confirmed last month by Amnesty International in a report that documents aerial bombardment by Ethiopians, followed by a systemic killing by Eritrean soldiers going door to door through the town. They particularly targeted young men and boys, prevented people from burying the dead, and then looted the town of everything of value, including food. Some commentators have said that food is being used as a weapon of war. In January, over 40 people were massacred at Debre Abbey. 300 people were killed in the attack on the Hitsats refugee camp. 300 people. At a village near Samra, 500 buildings were set on fire and 60 people are thought to have been killed. At a village called Bora, an estimated 100 people were murdered. Emaciated and starving people displaced by the violence are pouring into overcrowded towns. The Norwegian Refugee Council says 37,000 people have recently arrived at Shiraro, a town in northwestern Tigray where food, water and medicine are running out fast. The situation in Shiraro is beyond dire, the NRC chief Jan Egeland has warned. There are many parts of Tigray, particularly rural areas, where there is no communication and grave fears about the fate of local people, both in terms of violence and access to food, medicine and essential services. What is clear from both social media and independent reporting is that civilians have been targeted because of their ethnicity, because they are Tigrayan. Footage has been circulating of men in Ethiopian military uniforms speaking in Amharic, shouting abuse at groups of boys while shooting them and throwing their bodies over a cliff. And along with this has been the vandalising of symbols of Tigrayan culture, most notably Debre Damo Monastery and the Al-Najasi Mosque, one of the oldest in Africa. As the International Development Committee heard last week, economic and service infrastructure has been damaged, with factories looted and vandalised and banks closed, making it hard for humanitarian agencies to operate. The committee also heard about the destruction of health facilities, the result of systematic looting and vandalism by Eritrean and Ethiopian forces. Second, I want to talk about the widespread use of rape and sexual violence. It has been estimated that 10,000 women in Tigray have been raped, and recent reports on Channel 4, the BBC and CNN have all documented the horrific nature of the attacks, including kidnapping, imprisonment, rape and mutilation. On Monday of this week, an unprecedented letter signed by 12 leading figures in the international community called for the sexual violence to stop. They said there is only one medical facility in the whole region fully equipped to meet the survivors' needs. What especially stands out are the ferocity of the attacks. This is evidence from reports and photographs of injuries to women, including the mutilation of women's genitals. The targeting of women because they are Tigrayan. The rapists have talked of Amharanizing the women and purifying their blood. The use of rape as a weapon of war is always abhorrent and heinous, but for soldiers to claim to be purifying or cleansing women by raping them makes this violence look genocidal. And what also stands out is the impunity. There is no indication that either the Ethiopian or Eritrean governments are taking any steps whatsoever to rein in their troops. Those responsible for the sexual violence do so with complete impunity. On Tuesday, the Ethiopian government admitted there had been sexual assaults on women in Tigray, but sought to justify it as a consequence of the conflict. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in 2008, the UN Security Council unanimously approved Resolution 1820, which demands the immediate and complete cessation by all parties to armed conflict of all acts of sexual violence against civilians, and says they should immediately take appropriate measures to protect civilians, including women and girls, from all forms of sexual violence, including enforcing appropriate military disciplinary measures and upholding the principle of command responsibility. And it further goes on to say that rape and all other forms of sexual violence can constitute a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. This is tough and unequivocal language. The UK has the privilege of being a permanent member of the UN Security Council and has a responsibility to ensure this resolution is enforced. It was Lord Hague of Richmond, then Foreign Secretary, who campaigned alongside Angelina Jolie against the use of sexual violence in war and received an award for his efforts from the then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Now is the time for the Conservative government to prove that this was more than a publicity stunt. That brings me to my third and final point, the lack of response from the international community. The European Union, Germany and the United States paused their aid to Ethiopia, and the US administration last week sent the respected Senator Coons of Delaware to Addis Ababa. Ireland has led moves for the EU to apply targeted sanctions. However, the rest of the world has done little more than talk, and the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea have turned a deaf ear. What is needed is not more words, but action. So I'm asking the Minister for action on the following points. The Ethiopia Country Programme is the biggest UK bilateral aid programme, as the Minister stressed at the International Development Select Committee last week. Will Her Majesty's Government align its policies with the UK's international partners, the US, EU and Germany, and pause the parts of its aid programme which are going to the Ethiopian Government? Will Her Majesty's Government support the moves to set up an independent UN investigation into the massacres of civilians in Tigray, including those at Mai Kadra, Axum and Samre, the targeting of refugee camps, including those at Hitsats and Shemelba? Will Her Majesty's Government do this urgently before evidence, including of survivors at massacre sites and rape victims from hospitals in Mekelle, is removed or destroyed? Will the Government introduce targeted sanctions against those in Ethiopia and Eritrea responsible for the atrocities in Tigray, following the approach taken by the European Union? Will the Government continue to ensure that the UN Security Council remains actively engaged to end the war in Tigray with the abuses associated with it? Will they press for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean troops? and also seek to ensure there is an inclusive national dialogue in the country, as many Tigrayans have been calling for, to secure a lasting peace? Will the government specifically ensure that the evidence of widespread use of rape and sexual violence in the Tigray conflict is collated and the perpetrators brought to justice in line with UN Security Council Resolution 1820? It is wholly unacceptable that soldiers from the Ethiopian and Eritrean armies should be able to rape women with impunity, and it is equally unacceptable that their commanders-in-chief should permit their forces to use rape as a weapon of war or fail to bring justice to those under their command who commit such a crime. Will the government take steps to publicly support the US administration's initiatives to ensure that immediate and full access is provided to humanitarian agencies in Tigray, and that unfettered access will be provided for local and international journalists without repercussions for their translators and fixers? The Right Honourable Member for Esher and Walton, the Foreign Secretary, has spoken of his experience in taking war criminals to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Will the Minister therefore press him to take initial steps through the UN Security Council to bring prosecutions against those whom the evidence points to being responsible for war crimes in Tigray, including the use of rape? Mr Deputy Speaker, the effects of this war will continue long after the guns have fallen silent. There will be empty spaces where civilian populations were murdered, and there will be a cohort of children growing up who are the result of the rape of their mothers. This further illustrates why this is absolutely the wrong time for the UK government to be reneging on its promise to maintain UK aid spending at 0.7% of GNI, and I hope the Minister will also reflect further on this disastrous decision. Yet even now, the UK government can help avert yet more destruction in Tigray and can provide justice for the survivors of the massacres and for the women who have been raped. It will, however, take much more than words. It will take action, and that is what I and many others hope the Minister will commit to tonight.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank the Honourable Lady, the Member for Dulwich and West Norwood, for securing the debate this evening. This would normally be responded to by my Honourable friend, the Minister for Africa. Unfortunately, he is travelling, but I know he takes the issues that she has raised very seriously, and I will run through some of the points that he would have raised had he been able to be here. The crisis in Tigray is of grave concern, both to the UK government, Majesty's government, and indeed to members of this House. More than 4 months since the conflict has started, much of Tigray remains incredibly dangerous, both for the people that live there and for the humanitarian workers trying to deliver badly needed support. And as has been set out in the Honourable Lady's speech, the impact on civilians is indeed devastating. We are sadly aware that at least 5 workers, Ethiopian staff working for UK-funded NGOs, have tragically been killed in this conflict. I pay tribute to them here today for their courage, for their service, and ultimately for their sacrifice. The targeting of humanitarians is utterly unacceptable. The conflict has caused the collapse of essential and basic services: health, nutrition, water, sanitation. Life-saving maternal health care services and vaccines cannot be delivered, thereby endangering the lives of newborn children and their mothers. Huge numbers of people, likely more than 500,000, are in areas beyond the reach of aid agencies. And across the region, as she has said, 4.5 million people are now in need of life-saving humanitarian aid. The United Nations assesses that the overall humanitarian response remains deeply inadequate compared to the needs that we have assessed on the ground. The situation is indeed grave. We have also received ongoing reports of egregious human rights violations since the conflict has started. And as has been outlined in the speech made by the Honourable Lady, we are seeing and hearing of increasingly harrowing stories on almost a daily basis now of widespread murder, as she's highlighted, and indeed rape. Armed actors are subjecting civilians to appalling abuses and systematic campaigns of looting, as she says, largely with impunity. Eritrea's role in this conflict is particularly concerning, and as such, the UK has called upon them to leave Ethiopia immediately. There are numerous reports of atrocities involving Eritrean forces, and their presence is fueling insecurity. Since the start of the conflict in November, the UK has consistently called for unhindered and comprehensive access for relief agencies and journalists. Obviously, one of the greatest defences against the impunity which she has highlighted is the work of the media. And we've been clear that the protection of civilians must be a priority, and have pressed for investigations into the human rights abuses that she has highlighted, as well as the withdrawal of Eritrean forces. There can be no military solution to the problems in Tigray, and we have urged all parties to seek an inclusive political settlement to restore security and stability. In January of this year, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, travelled to Ethiopia. He visited a humanitarian logistics hub in Gondar, run by the World Food Programme, and heard firsthand from our agency partners about the difficulties faced delivering life-saving assistance. He also met with Prime Minister Abiy, the President and the Deputy Prime Minister. He emphasised to them the need for immediate humanitarian access and made clear the UK's serious concerns about the human rights violations, media freedom and political freedom. The Foreign Secretary and my honourable friend, the Minister for Africa, have also raised the situation with counterparts across the continent and internationally. And as she has suggested, these include recent conversations with the United States Secretary of State, Blinken. I have raised the issues with my counterparts in the Gulf, and the UK has been active in discussions at the United Nations Security Council. Most recently, on the 11th of March, my noble friend, the Minister for South Asia and the Commonwealth, called again for urgent action to be taken to avert a humanitarian catastrophe in a discussion on food insecurity and conflict in the other place. The UK has been a generous supporter of humanitarian activities. On top of our over £100 million of humanitarian assistance to Ethiopia this financial year, and an additional £15.4 million has been provided specifically to this crisis response. Our embassy in Addis Ababa has been working tirelessly and in very challenging circumstances to secure humanitarian access and press for the investigations into the human rights abuses and violations that she outlined in her speech. A team of UK officials from the embassy travelled to Mekelle, Tigray's principal city, on the 4th and 5th of March. United Nations and NGO staff were open about the complexities of operating in this environment and the extent of civilian suffering. At a site for displaced persons, our staff heard harrowing accounts of truly horrendous abuses. They saw a relief effort hamstrung by confused government systems struggling to keep pace with the needs of the people. And it's clear that obstacles to access have weakened the overall response to this devastating situation. One positive development is the recent announcement from the government of Ethiopia on access and their commitment to move to a system of access notification. Under this approach, responding organisations no longer have to wait for approval from Ethiopian authorities to enter Tigray. The UK is working with the United Nations and others to assess whether changes introduced by the authorities result in a demonstrable and positive improvement on the ground. And we can also cautiously welcome the improved access for the media in Tigray. And I know this is something the honourable member opposite will be interested in, as he has raised this privately with me. We also support the work of the United Nations Office for the Commissioner of Human Rights. And obviously we support their work. It is important. And we're glad to see that those staff are planning a joint mission with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. However, it is clear that media workers remain persecuted and at risk of detention. We're also concerned that the proposed joint human rights investigation will not be seen as impartial by the victims of the conflict. The crisis in Tigray comes as Ethiopia already faces huge humanitarian, economic and political pressures. In 2021, relief agencies will assist nearly 18 million people across the country. COVID-19, climate events, devastating locust invasions have already put paid to the prosperity of the region. Ethnic violence has increased in many regions and may rise further ahead of the planned elections in June of this year. The stakes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are very high, and this coming year will need concerted action by the international system and a strong and well-coordinated United Nations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me conclude by reassuring the House that the United Kingdom will continue to engage comprehensively with Ethiopia and to lead coordination with international partners in pressing for a political solution to this conflict that brings about an end to the violence. We will also ensure that investigations into atrocities are robust, unbiased, are credible and are trusted by the people of Tigray themselves, so that those committing abuses do not evade justice. In the meantime, it is our absolute priority to make sure humanitarian support continues to reach those in desperate need.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as that I can say aye. Aye. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.